Hello everybody and welcome to week 13 of Poll 205 Women in Politics. This week we're discussing women in the judiciary. Now there's three big things that I want to talk about in today's lecture. First, we're going to do a really brief refresher on the court structure. Second, we're going to talk about some of the first women who ever served on the courts. And then three, we're going to wrap up with a conversation about whether women judges are significantly different than male judges. Do they have different rulings? Do they have different influence on the courts? Intersectionality is going to be a big topic in today's lecture. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, as we've already talked about a little bit in this course, the courts are the final institution that we're going to be talking about. So we've already talked about Congress. Their job is to write the law. Last week, we talked about the executive branch. It's the president's job to enforce or execute the law. And now we're talking about the courts, whose primary responsibility is to interpret the law and to decide whether or not our laws violate or uphold the United States Constitution. So in the U.S., there's a three-tier court structure that I want you to know about. At the very bottom of this triangle, we have the federal courts. There are 94 of those. Next, we have the appellate courts or the circuit courts. There are 13 of those. And then finally, at the very apex of this triangle, we have the Supreme Court, right? That is the court of last resort in many regards. And I want you to know a few key things about what the Constitution says with respect to the courts that we have here. So the Supreme Court is the only court that's explicitly created by the United States Constitution. That's all spelled out in Article 3. The Constitution also grants Congress the power to create all other courts. So the appellate courts, the federal courts, that was all spelled out in the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789, and it was one of the first acts ever passed by Congress. Now let's talk about the types of cases that each of these courts hear. So state courts aren't even a part of this triangle, this three-tier court system that we're looking at here. State courts are completely separate. They're their own system, and each state is responsible for creating their own court structure. So in the state courts, right, we'll hear things like criminal cases, family law, probate court, civil cases, all kinds of things like that. And we can take a look here at this graphic to get a better understanding of what exactly the state court system looks like. So here's Wisconsin as an example. And you'll notice that the structure is very similar, moving from municipal courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. So each state has its own Supreme Court as well. So a majority of municipal courts, they will hear cases related to things like traffic, parking, ordinances, drug offenses. There are no jury trials involved in a majority of municipal court hearings. Next, we have tribal courts that hear cases involving parties who belong to Native American tribes, both criminal and civil. And just to clarify, right, when we're talking about criminal cases, we're talking about violations of state laws. When we're talking about civil cases, those are suits between individuals or individuals and organizations, right? Generally, we're dealing with some type of compensation claims. Next, at the state circuit court level, this is where we hear criminal and civil cases that are generally on appeal, right? So we're appealing decisions that were made at lower levels of the courts. And then we have the state Supreme Court that hears cases, again, on appeal from lower state courts. These could be cases involving state politicians or challenges to state laws as well. But let's go back to the federal court system, the national court system. Let's begin again at the very bottom of this triangle and talk about federal courts. So federal courts mostly hear cases in which the United States is a party. So we're talking about violations of the Constitution most commonly. So we might be looking at, does a state law, some law that was passed in a specific state, is that a violation of the United States Constitution? Or we could be talking about broader violations of federal law. Next, at the appellate court level, here we're talking about courts that mostly hear cases on appeal from the lower level courts. No new witnesses or evidence is presented. Most civil cases grant the right of appeal to both parties, and in most criminal cases, only the defendant or the accused has the right to appeal. And then that brings us finally to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has two different types of jurisdiction. First is original jurisdiction. This means that the Supreme Court is the only appropriate venue to be the first court to hear a case. So that could be one state suing another state, or the federal government suing a state, or the state suing the federal government, cases against foreign ambassadors, or, a citizen in one state suing a citizen in another state, right? So if we had a citizen in Florida suing another citizen in Georgia, it wouldn't be appropriate to hold that court case in either Florida or Georgia because we might perceive there to be some degree of bias, right? So the Supreme Court at the national level is the only appropriate venue to hear cases like that. And then finally, the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction, which simply means that it has the jurisdiction or the right to hear cases on appeal from lower federal courts. And so now that we have a better understanding of what the court system looks like and the type of cases it hears, I want to talk about representation. So there's approximately 30,000 state judges compared to only about 1,700 federal judges. And what's interesting is about 1/3 of all of these active judges are women. In fact, one interesting fun fact about Wisconsin is that Wisconsin has the most women serving on its state Supreme Court than any other state in the country. So it's pretty interesting. But let's talk about some of the historic firsts for women being appointed to the federal bench. I want to start with Genevieve R. Kline, appointed by President Coolidge in 1928 to serve on the U.S. Customs Court. She was the first woman appointed to the federal court in any capacity. And what's really shocking about this is that this is 140 years after the creation of the courts that we have our first female justice. Next, we have Florence Allen, who was appointed by President Roosevelt in 1934 to serve on the Court of Appeals. And then finally, the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, in 1981, appointed by President Ronald Reagan. And as much as I would love to talk about the accomplishments of each of these judges, we just really don't have time for that. But I want us to consider the big picture of the timeline of women serving on the court. So the first women to serve in the United States Congress, right? We've got Jeanette Rankin in 1916, Margaret Chase Smith in 1949. The first in the executive, Nellie Ross was our first female governor of Wyoming in 1924. Frances Perkins was the first woman to serve in a executive cabinet department. That's in 1933. Kamala Harris, our first vice president in 2020. I'm recording this before the election, so I have no idea if she won the presidency or not, so I apologize if this lecture is out of date. And then we have our first in the courts, Genevieve Kline, 1928, and Sandra Day O'Connor, not until 1981. And so there's a huge gap here, right? Specifically, when we're talking about the Supreme Court, we see that many of our institutional firsts with respect to women serving in important positions of power is really kind of clustered in the 20s, the 30s, maybe even to the 50s. But it's not until the 1980s that we have our first female serving on the court. And I kind of want to ask you, why do you think women's representation in the courts lagged so far behind other institutions? So that's where I want to introduce our first stop and think. I want you to think about what is it about the Supreme Court and its powers that might be different from other institutions of government where it would take so much longer for women to get their foot in the door in that institution. So go ahead and pause the video, take a moment to reflect on that prompt, and hit play when you're ready to proceed with the video. So maybe you came up with this point or not, but the first thing that I want to talk about that makes the courts so much different than other institutions of government is that the courts, in order to become a justice or to be appointed to any level of the courts, Supreme Court, appellate courts, federal courts, you don't get elected to those positions. You must be appointed by the president to serve as a federal judge or justice. And so maybe we can think about that kind of procedural barrier as being one of the primary reasons that explains why women lag so far behind their representation on the courts compared to other institutions. So we can look here, starting with the Carter presidency in 1977, U.S. presidents have made a pretty significant commitment to gender diversity on the federal bench. And we can think about, what was happening in 1977? Why was that kind of like this big catalyzing moment? And remember, right, we're right in the middle of second wave feminism. Those group of advocates who were super loud and radical and aggressive, and all of those very profound institutional and legal accomplishments by second wave feminists that occurred during this really radical era. We can also look at the racial diversity of presidential appointments of judges as well, and how those have significantly increased over time. So what we see is a general trend of presidents making a commitment to not only gender diversity in their appointments, but also racial diversity as well. And what's interesting is that we see, based on this chart here, we see that seems to be much more of a priority for Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. So, for instance, looking at Joe Biden's appointments, we can see that 66% of Joe Biden's federal judicial appointees were non-white, compared to Donald Trump, whose appointees, about 14% of his appointees were non-white. So we can also talk about this in the discussion boards too. Why do you think that the judicial appointees of Democrats are so much more racially diverse than Republican appointees? And so despite these historical lags, today women are most represented in the federal courts. About 33% of judges in the federal courts are women. Compare this to the state legislature, where only about 31% are women. There's only 27% of women in the Senate, 27% in the House, and only about 18% of state governors are women. So now we've got a much different story. And again, I think the factor that explains this most is that presidents have taken the lead on shifting these norms. There are the highest percentages of women in government within positions that are appointed rather than elected. Okay, and the final thing that I want to talk about are whether or not women judges differ than men in any significant way. And so one big topic that usually comes up during conversations like this are whether or not women judges are tough on crime or they're too soft on punishment. And so we can have another kind of stop and think here. Do you think that women judges are more likely to institute strict punishments on crime, or do you think that they're more likely to be lenient with their sentencing? So go ahead and take a moment to pause here and reflect here. Think about this prompt and think about why you believe this. Why do you think that women might be more tough on crime than male judges? Or come up with some reasons why you think women might be softer on punishment compared to their male colleagues. So take a moment to pause, reflect on this, and when you're ready, go ahead and hit play. Okay, so I'm curious to hear in the discussion boards how your opinions on this change with respect to some of the things that we're about to cover. So let's talk about this topic, whether or not women are too tough on crime or soft on punishment. We're going to start with this really seminal study from 1999 that examined gender differences in judicial decision making. And what this very first study found on this topic is that women were 10% more likely to incarcerate and impose prison terms that were about 5 months longer on average compared to male judges. So this very first study in the late 90s that investigates this issue found that women were actually a lot tougher on crime compared to male judges. And so I want you to think about, why do you think this is? Why would women be so much tougher on crime compared to their male counterparts? And so what a lot of scholars have posited over the years is that gender stereotypes is likely a powerful motivator of behavior. And because we assume, because of gender stereotypes, that women will be more lenient on the accused, that they're more compassionate, they're more empathetic, simply by virtue of their gender, that this probably encouraged women to be tougher so that they were taken more seriously. So again, we're talking about the double bind, this double standard, and how gender stereotypes influence behavior. However, more recent research suggests that women are in fact becoming increasingly more lenient. Looking at this 2014 study of over 600,000 federal criminal cases, they found that women impose sentences approximately 1.7 months shorter. And again, we might ask ourselves, well, why is this? And it, again, might very well be the point that, after decades of women's presence being legitimized on the federal courts, that perhaps those women are less concerned about how they are perceived, or they're less concerned about having their decisions critiqued as a function of their gender, whether or not they're being too masculine or too feminine, too soft or too tough. So, again, some really interesting gender dynamics that we see with women on the courts. In this same study, the author also found that Democratic-aligned judges were also significantly more lenient with their sentencing, about 2.2%, and judges from the South were significantly harsher with their decisions, approximately a 11-month difference. And this is a really interesting thing about our court system in the United States, right? That there's so much discretion given to judges, and that discretion can vary so radically state to state to state. So based upon whether or not you committed a crime in the South or the non-South, or whether or not the judge presiding over your case is Democrat or a Republican or a male or a female, it's fascinating to think that that can have such a significant impact on your sentencing, somewhere up to an 11-month difference, which is just wild to think about. I also want to introduce some social psychology research that talks about why women judges might differ so much from men. And here in Carol Gilligan's seminal work, In a Different Voice, she grapples with these differences of moral development and psychology between men and women. And a key question in this book is, do men and women think about societal problems differently? In one part of her book, she talks about how we define what is immoral or what is bad as a society, and how men and women might define those concepts differently. What's interesting is that, according to Gilligan's research, men often think about these questions in terms of what is fair. There's an emphasis on the individual, whereas women often think about this question in terms of caretaking, and there's an emphasis on society. So according to Gilligan, all of this boils down to socialization. And to illustrate how men and women come to different definitions of what is fair, what is moral, what is good, what is bad, she examines how young boys and girls resolve disputes during play. So what's really interesting is that she talks about how boys are hyper-competitive and they focus on the individual and the rigidity of rules. Girls are more flexible with rules. There's more of a focus on community and cooperation. So, things like imagine kids are playing hide and seek, right? And you've got a group of boys playing this game and a group of girls playing this game. And so, for instance, when, it comes out or somebody is caught cheating during these games, right? When boys catch other boys cheating during a game, they're punished for that. They're very competitive. You broke the rules. You made things unfair. You can't play with us anymore. Get out of here. Girls, on the other hand, at least according to Gilligan's research, were less likely to resolve dispute in that way. And instead, if someone was caught cheating in a group of play involving young girls, there was less focus on punishment and more discussion about what led that individual to cheat in the first place. And again, there's just a lot more emphasis on compassion and understanding and trying to create, community in that group of play rather than focusing on competition and winning. So I think that these are some really fascinating things to consider when we're talking about gender differences in decision making, particularly when it comes to political decision making. Studies have also found significant differences in court rulings when at least one woman is present on the bench. So here, just having women present on the courts can have a significant impact on decision making. This 2005 study illustrates how the number of women on the bench increased the likelihood of pro-plaintiff decisions on sexual harassment or discrimination cases. In other words, when individuals would bring accusations of sexual harassment or discrimination to the court, the probability that the court agreed with that plaintiff increased significantly based upon the number of women who were hearing that case. And we've talked a lot about intersectionality throughout this course, but I want to take a moment to really talk about that term and to give credit to Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined this term, intersectionality, in 1989. Again, intersectionality is a framework for understanding how race, gender, and class intersect and overlap. And we've also seen the weaponization of this term, intersectionality, to be often misunderstood as this concept that minorities get special treatment. In particular, Crenshaw's research highlights intersectionality in the American legal system. And I want to share this quote from Dr. Crenshaw. "Pervasive stereotypes about Black women not only shape the kind of harassment that Black women experience, but also influence whether Black women's stories are likely to be believed. Historically, Black women's words were not taken as true. Judges were known to instruct juries to take a Black woman's word with a grain of salt." And so I think it's important to understand these historic inequities in our court systems and, frankly, all of our institutions of government, to understand better how identity and intersectionality play such a pivotal role in our politics and political decision making. And to emphasize this, I want to share a 2008 study discussing this role of intersectionality on the courts. And so what's interesting about this study is that they don't find significant differences in how women judges or judges of color make their decisions. Intersectionally, however, this study finds that Black women judges were 6 to 10% more likely to support pro-plaintiff decisions in sexual discrimination cases than other judges. I think that that's very fascinating, especially considering the quote that we just read from Dr. Crenshaw on the previous slide. So, in summary, I want us to consider, do women make a difference on the courts? And do women do their jobs in any significantly different way compared to male judges? Throughout this lecture, we've kind of discussed reasons for that, yes, that women are different, and then we also looked at evidence that suggests maybe no, not really. So in the definitely yes category, right, there's some evidence that women are more lenient on sentencing. The presence of women has court-level outcomes. However, this is mainly specific to discrimination cases. We also find that intersectionality is related to more liberal court decisions. But again, this is mainly specific to discrimination cases. And then in the no, not really column, we could talk about how on almost all legal matters, women rule the same as men. This is discussed in detail in your textbook. Opinion writing is not much different than men. And here maybe conformity is a good thing, because we have to ask ourselves, do we really want men and women enforcing and interpreting the law uniformly or differently? All right, everybody, those were just a few points that I wanted to share in today's video lecture. I really hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.